Lyndon Forbes, Samson Bonham, well known as the master politician and was an outstanding statesman. He was a great leader, another hero, you understand. That's why we remember Lyndon Forbes Bonham.
Fourth Sunday of the month of November, and we're here with you again, the other program, The State of the Nation, that comes to you through the auspices of the Lyndon Forbes Samson Bonham Foundation. Today we will be addressing an interesting topic which is of interest to all Guyanese. It's a topical issue right now. But before we go into our program, I want to apologize because today's program we ought to have had the candidates that are vying for the leadership of the People's National Congress. I know that there were 3 persons that had put up their hands to say that they were vying for the position, but there were others. And since we are trying to be fair, we have not at this time been able to get from the PNC those persons who will be running or vying for the position of leadership. So as for this reason, and we have not been able to kind of confirm the list of those who have been nominated. So in fairness to everyone, we have decided that we will shift that particular program which ought to have been for today, and further to that, all 3 candidates that had put their hands up, 2 of them are unavailable for this program today, and the other one, because of the fairness to the others, we thought we should just perhaps put the program back for another day when we will be able to have all the candidates whose hands are up for the position of leader of the People's National Congress reform. So far we understand that the election for leadership of the party will be held on the 11th of December 2021. So that's for that, and on today's program, the topical issue is the Representation of People's Act. Now, that is a subject that sounds simple, but it affects every Guyanese in the 216,000 square kilometers of Guyana. I wish to tell you that. And I told you before that this program is geared towards educating our people, educating them in relation to critical issues that affect their lives. And we feel that the Representation of the People's Act, which is a mechanism by the state to guide us in relation to elections, is one of those things that people need to understand. So today with me in the studio is Mr. Vincent Alexander, chairman of the foundation, and I notice that the government has submitted or made an attempt at electoral reform by suggesting some amendments to this act. And I would like Mr. Alexander to give our viewers a historical perspective in relation to this whole question of electoral reform.
Thank you very much, Clayton, and good morning to viewers. Guyanans embarked on this process of electoral reform in the constitution reform process in 1999. As a consequence of that, our electoral system was enhanced. We introduced a hybrid between constituencies and a top-up arrangement, with proportional representation remaining as a fundamental element of our electoral system. However, the process in 1999-2001, in terms of the electoral reform specifically, as a part of the constitutional reform process, was incomplete. It was incomplete because we know that the court ruled that elections must have been held in 2001, 1 year short of the normal cycle. And the constitutional reform process in relation to electoral reform looked at the question of constituencies, which we did not have up to 1997 election. We didn't have constituencies. We merely had, Guyana was one constituency, and we used a system of proportional representation. But the reform process introduced the idea of constituencies, and because of time, we could not address drawing up new constituencies in time for 2001 election. And so what we decided at that time was that since we had in existence 10 regions, which are also 10 electoral districts, that we will use those 10 electoral districts as 10 constituencies and allocate 25 seats across those 10 constituencies, but that once we were through with the 2001 elections, we would get back to the constitutional reform process to complete elements of the reform, including the whole question of the electoral system, and more specifically to deal with the question of our constituencies. So that was where we were in 2001. As a part of the electoral reform process, we also established in the Parliament a committee that would be responsible for constitutional matters, and this would include electoral matters. Unfortunately, between 2001 to 2021, there has been no action on this matter, although there was a commitment to action which was given in 2021. So there be no action. So electoral reform remained on the back burner for some 20 years, although we had committed to electoral reform, a continuation of electoral reform in 2001. So that's the first aspect I want to refer to, that in terms of electoral reform, this is not a new process. This is really a process that should have been ongoing coming out of the 2001 elections and the 1999-2001 constitutional reform process. From a standpoint of a background, one may also argue that this issue has been put back onto the table in 2021 by the present government after the elections of 2020. So that in some regards, the elections of 2020 are informing this activity referred to as electoral reform now in 2021. So the occurrences during the period of the elections in 2020 are the basis on which the current government has re-entered into this activity of electoral reform, and as a consequence of that, at this point in time, have put on the table amendments to the Representation of the People's Act as what they refer to as electoral reform. The question is, does that suffice as electoral reform, given the fact that we had a certain commitment to reforms that do not in any way speak to this question, the questions being raised now, but spoke to the question of our constituencies and how we will configure those constituencies, given the fact that our Constitution provides for 50% of the seats to be constituency seats. Our Constitution provides for accountability of the parliamentarians to the electorate, and in that context, an electoral system that provides for that accountability. We established a Constitutional Committee in the Parliament to deal with these matters, and they have not been dealt with. and apparently are not being dealt with now either. And so it raises the question as to whether what is before us is indeed the electoral reform that the people of Guyana committed to way back in 2001, or is it something that merely responds to the concerns of the present regime coming out of the elections of 2020? So I think we need, as we go forward, to clearly understand what is the motive behind this so-called electoral reform, and what is the interest that has spawned this electoral reform at this time.
Yeah, I thank you, Vincent. I do like that perspective historically, and I want to tell our viewers that we will be allowing you to participate in this discussion today, and we will open the lines not very long from now so that you can be part of this discussion. Now, Vincent, but you did say, but those proposals which you have mentioned that is coming now from the government seem to kind of suggest that it's more or less administrative kind of function of the electoral machinery and has nothing in relation to the in-depth historical perspective that you have given. What ought to have been the approach kind of procedurally that should have been informing this process?
Thank you very much, Clayton. Now, any reform process has to have certain procedures. If you're reforming the electoral system, then one would base this reform, I would think, on an evaluation of the operation of the system. We have had the opportunity between 2001, in 2006, 2011, 2015, 2020, to operate, to work our electoral system. And therefore one would assume that an evaluation of that electoral system would be what informs your electoral reform. Included in that evaluation would be the observations made over the years by observers.
Yes.
And so we've had observer themes here from the EU, from the OAS, from the Commonwealth, from CARICOM, and local observers throughout those elections. And these observers have made observations about our electoral system and areas in which they think reform is required. So one would assume that if you're going into the electoral reform process, that a part of your evaluation of your electoral system would be what the observers would have said. Mm-hmm. And there are many things our observers have said which I'll refer to later. But what we see here is a process that is not based on an evaluation coming from the involvement of the stakeholders in pronouncing what they think is required given what they experienced between 2001 and 2020. So that's one of a tremendous deficiency of this process from a procedural perspective, because it seems to not pay attention to the essential element of any such process, which is an evaluation of what pertained before. Mm-hmm. More specifically, in terms of the procedures, GECOM is the agency responsible for elections. Mm-hmm. And GECOM itself should be involved in an evaluation after each election. Therefore, GECOM should be integral from the very inception of the reform process, because GECOM would have operated the system, should have evaluated the system, and therefore should be a primary stakeholder in making suggestions as to what should be done in relation to the electoral reform system. So that's another issue, I think, from a procedural perspective, that is a clear deficiency of the current endeavor. In fact, it is even worse than that, because I think announcements were made somewhere around November the 2nd,
Yeah.
on this question of electoral reform. The draft amendments, I think, were made public at that time. They were distributed to various organizations, various stakeholders. But GCOM itself was not a recipient at that time of these proposals. It was not a recipient. In fact, it is not until the 12th of November, 10 days after the public had been advised, 10 days after the media carried extracts from the proposed amendments, that GCOM was brought into the loop merely by a circulation of the draft amendments, as was the case prior to other organizations. So I would consider that another flaw in the system, that even if you omitted the fundamental act of involving GCOM from the inception, then it is even more absurd that GCOM was not a recipient of the draft at the very inception, just giving them time to be able to discuss, because there's a time frame that has been associated with this
correct.
consultative process.
Correct. I think it's 6 months they said or something.
6 weeks.
Six weeks.
6 weeks.
6 weeks.
And GCOM has not been given that complete period because of the late dissemination of the agenda to GCOM. So that's another big procedural question that has arisen. On one hand, you have not seek to continue the process as was committed 2001. The second hand, you have not involved the major stakeholder in the crafting of the draft. On the third hand, you have not used an evaluation that is known to the public at large as the basis for determining how you will go forward in this electoral reform process. But all of those things notwithstanding, you have a draft, which can only be a draft reflecting the interests and the disposition of the government. An electoral reform cannot be simply about the government putting forward its disposition. The very act of governance itself talks about inclusion, and that inclusion should involve the other stakeholders. Clearly, they will be involved now in the consultative process, notwithstanding the fact that the Attorney General has said unequivocally that if there is no meeting of minds among the parties, and more specifically between the government and the opposition, that they will proceed to the Parliament to have these reforms effective. So to me, there's serious procedural flaws, both from the standpoint of governance and from the standpoint of where we were at in 2001, who are the main actors in this process, and the fact that what we have so far merely reflects the views of the regime itself, which is but one party in the electoral reform process, because electoral reform affects all Guyanese and all parties, and every effort should be made from a governance perspective to ensure that all of the parties from the very inception are involved, and more critically, that GCOM, as the body which is responsible for actualizing our electoral processes, a body which is in a position to comment on what has occurred between 2001 and present time, that body was excluded from the primary activity of drafting the amendments.
I want to comment here, Vincent, and I am very happy for the points you made in relation to where this whole amendment proposal is coming from, because it is being made with the assumption that you don't have other persons or organizations, individuals in Guyana that can contribute to this process, which you said started under the Constitutional Kind of Reform Committee in 2001. They're assuming that other guys. I think, this is my personal view, this 6-week time frame for an issue as sensitive and as important as this one is one of the first area that need to be cancelled, because people out there would like to contribute. People would like to share their views. People have ideas how this thing can be corrected, because like you rightly said, historically there has been a pattern, and over the years the country has received kind of recommendations from observers, including Guyanese, as to what needs to be done. It is very unfortunate that the government has taken this kind of disposition to say that they would, if they're not meeting of minds, they're going to ram this down people's throat and go into parliament. It is very unfortunate that they have taken this approach, because people out there are interested in making a contribution of what needs to be done to our electoral system, so that they think, and in fact the whole issue, it needs to be simplified.
Well,
so people can
Peter,
understand.
you've made a very critical point, and that is the point of the people's interest in the process. And that point points to another fundamental flaw in the process. What the government has done is to circulate amendments and to ask people to make comments on those amendments. That's what they've done. They have not embarked on the kind of consultation which allows persons to interface with the drafters so that they can find out from the drafters what was their real intent in terms of what they brought before them.
Correct.
Because it's only an understanding of the real intent of the drafters that would allow people to do one of two things. Either to say, based on your intent, here is what I think should be done in terms of these reforms. And so that's on one hand what should happen. But people may also say that your intent is not responsive to the real issues of electoral reform. And therefore that kind of consultation would really allow for the views of the stakeholders to impact the process in a manner that it cannot impact the process if they're only asked to comment on a document. So they're not being asked to be involved in the reform process, in that they say, well, look, here is the scope we think the reform should have. This is the depth of the reform. No, no, no. In some regards, by the amendments before us, the scope has been predefined.
Correct.
And the people are excluded from that scope. And as I've said earlier, it is clear that the scope does not take into consideration commitments on electoral reform that we made in 2001. So the scope is obviously deficient. But we are not in a position to comment on the scope, because basically what they're saying to us, here is a document, comment on that document. And so they are kind of blinkering Guyanese into their view of what areas should be addressed in this so-called electoral reform process. And so you're quite correct, because if you're going to have a true consultative process, 6 weeks is inadequate, even for the process that they have embraced. Now, they're going to say to us probably, well, you know, there's COVID and all of that. But that wouldn't fly, because the said regime has been holding various activities at the convention center. And so the argument of COVID inhibiting the kind of consultations that are necessary cannot stand scrutiny, because they have repeatedly held activities at the convention center. And therefore we know that from their perspective, if they care to, they could have the kind of consultation which requires face-to-face involvement and provides an opportunity not only to comment on what they have put before you, but to inquire what is the real intent, and to put forward ideas beyond that real intent. If the public is of the view that electoral reform requires much more action than merely some amendments to the Representation of the People's Act, because basically what's before us is not a comprehensive proposal of electoral reform. What's before us is some amendments to the Representation of the People's Acts, amendments which are a reflection of the thinking of the regime, and basically when people think, they think within their own interests, and therefore does not reflect the concern of Guyanese in terms of electoral reform.
But I like I want to tell our viewers that in another 5-6 minutes we will be opening the lines for your contribution, because we are looking at the Representation of the People's Act and the recent proposals for amendments to this act by the current government. I want to say also, Vincent, that when we look, these proposed amendments speak only to changes in the electoral structure in Region 4. And when I reflect on the issues that were being discussed from 2001 in relation to electoral reform, it incorporated a broader perspective in relation to what needs to be done. So even in that sense, these proposals are restricted in relation to electoral reform. I would like to have a comment on that.
Well, what one would find, Faithon, is that there is a fundamental aspect of the amendments which is specific to Region 4. And that is the whole question of dividing Region 4 into 4 sub-districts for the purpose of the conduct of elections, and more specifically for the purpose of the count and the declaration of the results of the district. Now, one may look at that and ask, why? And here again, I go back to the point I made earlier. If you have a consultation, you will be able to interrogate the drafters as to why you're doing this. What's the motive behind this? So far, the motive as articulated in the statements made by the government suggests that the system in Region 4 is inefficient, and therefore there's need for some decentralization to make the system more efficient. If one takes that as the basis, the question arises, how efficient in comparative terms, are the systems in the other 9 electoral districts? Now, efficiency here has to do with how you utilize your manpower and how you utilize your time to get a result. The fact of the matter is that if one does a survey of what pertains in other regions, starting with the hinterland regions, one would see that a declaration at a central location in the hinterland regions causes a delay because of the geography of those regions. And if you take Region 8, for example, once you have concluded your poll in Region 8 and your count, you cannot move the results of those areas to the central point for central tabulation until the next day. You can't move it until the next day. The same applies largely to the Region 7 area. In terms of Region 9, you can probably make some movement by road, but it takes a long time. So that in terms of quickness of declaration of results, which is a part of the efficiency problem in Region 4, as they contend, it is even more stark in other regions. It is even more stark. And therefore, if you are serious and truthful and sincere about efficiency being the problem, then the other regions should be addressed at this point in time as well. Region 6, Region 3, all of those regions should similarly be addressed. In fact, all regions. So tremendous suspicion is caused by the specific attention to Region 4, a region where there is the possibility of the movement of results 24/7. It does not have the problem which the other regions have in terms of the movement of results. And more than that, if we go back to the report of the observers, we will see that the observers have all said that they thought GCOM's systems worked well across all regions. And what is claimed to have happened in Region 4 has nothing to do with the systems that they are seeking to redress. Nothing to do with them, because those systems in Region 4 worked. Everything was moved and brought to a central point, and all of the contentions of irregularities are focused on that central point. But now you are creating 4 central points in a region where there were not problems in those areas. And so what is this really, what's the mischief really that you're trying to address? On one hand, you say it's efficiency, but if it's efficiency, then it can't be just Region 4.
That's
in fact,
right.
Region 4 might be more efficient than the other regions, given the geography and the possibility of the movement of things 24/7. So it can be efficiency. And it can't be that those areas were problematic in one way or the other. They were not. And the reports of all of the observers said they were not problematic. So what is the problem that is being addressed? And one can only be suspicious that they have ulterior motives. And one cannot embrace a reform if one does not understand the motive, and if one comes to the conclusion that the motive is ulterior, and if one clearly sees as what is being done, it flies in the face of the articulation of the reason, because if that was the reason, then this matter should be addressed in 10 districts, 10 regions, and not merely in Region 4.
I'm glad for that that comment, because in talking to people before coming to this program, some people have expressed the view that one, like you said before, the duration, the period identified for persons in the country to comment, 6 weeks, is inadequate. The second point they made to me is that there is a need, if we're going to address electoral reform, and you have quite aptly described what needs to be done, the scope need to be widened to address many other anomalies that exist within the system, other than just specifically trying to address, in the name of efficiency, the issue that came up in 2020 in Region 4 alone. And you have quite rightly, substantively, what we have existing currently. I mean, I need to get our views in there. I'm going to be opening the lines in another few minutes, so I would like to hear your views in relation to that.
Clayton, I think we also need to look at, beyond what is recommended for Region 4, what is recommended all told in this representation of the People's Act.
Just, I'm going to start to take calls now, so, morning on here.
Good morning. I would like to know if the representation in the People Act is just for election alone, or for the citizen on the day-to-day going with all the laws and the judiciary and so. If not, if it's just for election, well then how come the same representation in the People Act used to install a government when they should call a fresh election if they have a problem with the vote or whatever it is on ballot box? They should call a fresh election, but then it's not a representation in the People Act, it's a representation in people trick. Because they're tricking the people, you understand? And another thing,
Yes, sir.
what Mr. Alexander them doing with these people want to install Go, and they claim that Louis Field and all these is fraudsters, and they're putting in the man who creates fraud. Because Mr. Alexander caught him but 2 times or 3 times already trying a trick. I don't know if you can remember the story.
Yeah, I do.
Alexander caught him.
Yes, I remember.
How come the Representation of the People Act working for just one set of people and not the other set of people. They mean they need to change the Representation of the People Act plus the whole Constitution again, because the court and everything just go one side in this election. And the lawyers who represent us only going to court is one thing all the time. Who got jurisdiction? This is not the essence was for the case. The essence of the case is supposed to be what we agreed to in Article 6 of 2020. Now who got jurisdiction? Because who we agreed to, this is what we supposed to go to court for. Now who got jurisdiction over this and jurisdiction over that? You understand me, Mr. Alexander? Thank you very much. I listen to you respond.
Yeah, okay, sir. Thanks.
Thank you
Go ahead.
very much. That's quite a mouthful. First of all, the Representation of the People's Act is an act that really regulates the administration of elections.
Correct.
That is what it does. That regulates the administration of elections. Secondly, I would like to advise the caller that Mr. Boodoo has withdrawn his application. So GCOM no longer has before it an application from Boodoo to be considered for appointment as the Chief Elections Officer. Of course, the application itself was an absurdity, but I think fortunately good sense has prevailed and Mr. Boodoo has withdrawn that application. The caller has made some other cogent points. One is about what's before the court presently, the whole question of jurisdiction. I would not comment on matters that are before the court. I would allow the court to deal with those matters. So I would, though I have a view, I would restrain myself from comment. The matter is sub judice, so I wouldn't comment on it. Suffice to say, one should recognize that the amendments speak to some other things. Some of the things which the amendment speaks to are things which GCOM have traditionally practiced. So they are not real substantive changes in what would occur in our electoral system. For example, the manner in which GCOM makes decisions about polling stations is now being enshrined in law. But in fact, the practice has been over the years for GCOM to do exactly what they're saying. For example, GCOM has a decision which says that no polling station should administer more than 350 to 400 voters. They're now putting that into law. But we've been doing this, so it's no big thing.
Yeah.
It's no big thing. So, and there are a number of areas in which that is what they're doing, simply enshrining what GCOM has been doing. But by so doing, what they're doing is interfering with the flexibility of GCOM to be responsive to circumstances on the ground. So they may be making things more problematic rather than properly regulating things by virtue of some of the things of the amendments which they are proposing. And I've given one example. But in giving you one example about polling stations, one should also address one's mind to them enshrining the fact that private residents could be polling stations. This has been an area of concern over the years. GCOM's position up to the last election was, in principle, private residents should not be polling stations, and that we should seek as far as possible to get public places to be polling stations. They have now gone ahead and said, look, yes, make private residence polling stations once the people in those who own those residents are not politically affiliated. Balgadosh. Because the fact of the matter is that we're all voters and have some affinity in one way or the other to a political party. And who is to make this real determination of whether the private residence is owned by somebody affiliated or not affiliated? So that they're taking away from GCOM the flexibility that GCOM has had in terms of making sure that polling stations are places that are public places, and in fact providing the opportunity for polling stations to be embedded in enclaves that are enclaves of one or the other political party, in which circumstance you're creating situations where other parties will have difficulties in terms of comfort zone to be observers in those enclaves. these elections go on beyond 6 o'clock into the night when people have to count. And you have people who will not be comfortable being in certain enclaves beyond 6 for their own safety. And so what you're doing in a sense is creating circumstances for the exclusion of people who should be there to scrutinize the count. So that this is something that should really be in the purview of GCOM to make a determination in terms of the actual circumstance on the ground, rather than having some law that says, look, use private residence with some innocuous contention that use them once they're not associated with
The political party.
political parties. So here again we see that the interest probably of the drafters is being served rather than an understanding of the real situation confronting this country, where certain places are not places where one could easily have a free and fair election because of it's an enclave of a party rather than a reflection of the electorate at large. Now you can't interfere with that, that's a reality. But you have to respond to that in a manner that allows for polling stations where people can comfortably spend the entire period from dusk, from dawn to dusk,
Yes.
ensuring that they scrutinize those things. So here again you have a contentious aspect of things. So on one hand, I'm saying that much of what you find in the amendments are a reflection of practices of GCOM, but GCOM would have had flexibility in its practice. Now you're removing the flexibility. And on the other hand, you have some things that are clearly not in the interests of a free and fair election. And the other thing which you're doing, which we must address, is the question of the penalties for infractions.
Well, I was just
You
coming to
have
that.
some, on one hand, the penalties are draconian beyond consideration, completely draconian. But not only are they draconian, but they are penalties in law which could be seen as strict liability. What does that mean? It means that once somebody commits a certain act, even if the person committed the act without bad intent, it could be an error, could be misjudgment. Once the person commits the act, the person is then found to be guilty of a crime with draconian sanctions, $5 million, $10 million, 10 years in jail, life imprisonment. Now, what's the impact of this? Impact of this, apart from it in itself being wrong, is that you are now going to scare people away
Precisely.
from working with GCOM. GCOM has had problems in the past with getting the people of the appropriate standard and quality to conduct its elections. And now you are putting in place acts, laws that will make people decide that they can't work in a place where if they make an error. For example, one of the provisions would be that if you do not allow a polling clerk into a polling station, then that's an offense. And that offense could attract a $5 million fine and years imprisonment. Now, if a presiding officer determines that a polling clerk is improperly dressed and says, well, you can't come in, that's tantamount now to an offense. Tantamount to an offense. So no presiding officer, nobody wants a job where if they can't exercise that kind of judgment, and if they exercise it, then they're found guilty of an offense with draconian penalties. And so we're going to interfere significantly with the manpower available to GCOM and with the quality of the manpower.
Right.
Because people of quality and of certain standards not going to expose themselves to that kind of situation. So here again we find that they are doing acts that will exclude people, the quality of people who are required for an involvement in the elections, and will create a situation where GCOM's standards and efficiencies will be affected in the name of making elections better.
For all those reasons you have expressed, all those issues that seem to, and I should tell our viewers that the lines are now open. You can make a contribution, make your calls. That's precisely the word out there is that, one, the time frame to address these issues, and I think what the people are saying, look, and you have rightly addressed it, historically, our elections have kind of reports that were done. And anything, because you go into the past so you can know how we got where we are now, and what those trends, and the trends which you have addressed, the things that have been happening, which GCOM have been addressing in a systematic way, they are now putting them into law, and at the same time kind of restricting that flexibility to address these, what I will call small issues that seem to be affecting the process, because GCOM essentially is responsible overall for the conduct of our elections. And that's why people are saying that this question of public education, public information that need to be shared to simplify these matters and to accept contribution from people out there who know what needs to be done. The 6 weeks thing doesn't make any sense.
Clayton, there is another fundamental deficiency of the so-called reform. Reform is supposed to be intended to improve your system. Reform is supposed to be responsive to the concerns of the stakeholders about deficiencies in the system. One of the major concerns that has been expressed is that of the electoral list.
Yes.
In a country of a population of 700 and something people,
750, 760.
760,000 people. Our electoral roll is 661,000, providing opportunities for manipulation on election day, and opportunities which have been proven to have occurred because the register or registrants has provided information to show that people listed as dead were able to vote. The chief immigration officers provide information to show that people who were not in the country are recorded to have voted. And this critical, fundamental, and serious matter does not attract attention in the reform. You're talking electoral reform. GCOM and everybody had agreed in 2008 that we would do a renewal of the electoral roll via house registration every 7 years. In 2020, there was a vote to provide for house-to-house registration. The Parliament unanimously agreed on the money. It's accepted we should have this thing. And now we have the problems. We're doing reform, and there's absolutely no attention to the question of the electoral roll and the need for us to address that role, how we keep it as a clean rule, as we agreed to in 2008 and as we had budgeted for in 2020.
I want to take this call. Morning, you're on the air.
Morning again, gentlemen.
Yes, sir.
Since I'm 57 next month. And since I live in 750 the population, well, I'd like to know if 750,000 is the voting population, because the other can got 750,000 still, and I got into 57. Then there's my mother and my father and all these people. They're supposed to be 750, because when they used to go to school, was 750. You understand, man? He's a big man now. And it's still 750 a year.
750
I'd like to know from Mr. Alexander if 750 is the voting population.
750 is not.
Thank you very much.
It's not the voting
Yeah, okay.
population. 750 is contended to be the overall population of the country. That 750 has been, as it is for the longest while, has to do with the number of people who leave Guyana. So although they are births that should carry the number up, the extent to which people migrate is the extent to which the actual population is in a sense stagnated. It's not the same people. You have new people and things like that. But the point I am making is that you have a population of 750. You have a school population of over 200,000,
plus.
which brings us down immediately to an under 18 population of not more than 500 and something thousand. But a voters list of 600 and something thousand, which obviously means that the voters list is bloated. And mechanisms ought to be put in place to make sure the voters list reflects the real voting population in this country. And the extent to which information is being provided to show that the dead who are on the list and the migrants who are on the list have voted really suggests that this is a problem that has to be addressed. We have no mechanism in Guyana to take off of our voters list unless we do house registration. All them Guyanese who are registered went to America and died. They are on our voters list. And those are the names that can be used to manipulate the elections. And this is a fundamental issue. And this so-called reform completely ignores this fundamental issue that we all accept insofar as we agreed in 2008 that every 7 years we'll do house to house to deal with the question of our list. We all in 2020 in Parliament voted money to do house to house, so that we have all accepted that this is an issue that ought to be addressed. But here in 2021, a government is saying they're doing reform, and in the face of the court making certain decisions, have expressed absolutely no view as to how this issue that the nation had agreed will deal with in a particular way over time can now be dealt with, given what the court ruled in 2020 in relation to house registration and its impact.
I'm glad you've raised that one, Vincent, because that has been a contentious issue even going into the election, because a lot of Guyanese were saying, why go into elections with a bloated list? All those questions were very prevalent in all the communities across this country, and here's a case where I just need to, let me take this call. Morning, you're on the air.
Yes, good morning.
Morning.
I'm asking a question.
Yes, please.
I'd like to know if we are going into any election without that list being clean. That list must be clean. It must be clean.
I hear you.
We cannot go into elections. No way.
All right. I will have Mr. Alexander come in.
Well,
Thank you.
there's some matters in which I think the voice of the people has to be the determinant voice.
Yes.
And apparently, given the disposition of the framers of the amendment, this matter of a clean list, I think the voice of the people will have to be the determinant voice.
The other issue, Vincent, even with the limited proposed amendments that they have put down, what I was saying, talking to people before this program, they're saying, look, the trend has been this government has a disposition of putting on paper things that they have already kind of decided on. Let us assume that based on the disposition and the comments of Mr. Nandalal saying that they would go to Parliament if there is not a meeting of minds, and they go ahead ignoring all these concerns and irritants in relation to our electoral system, and go with this thing that just speak to changes in Region 4. What? The big question is what?
Well, again, elections and electoral matters are matters that concern the citizens at large. In the first instance, the representatives of political parties will obviously have to take positions and to seek to move things in a particular direction. If the results of that are not acceptable, then the citizens themselves will have to be more integrally involved in pushing for what they want.
Yeah, because the simple comparison, the caller was saying that since he was small, the population was 750. Well, of course, you know, people migrate, go travel different places. The population is not static. And you have an electoral list over 661. Student population over 200. Morning, you're on the air.
Yeah, good morning.
Morning.
I thought last month's program you say would bring the 3 candidates for the PNC thing, but I see that you didn't take talk much.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry that you didn't hear me at the start of the program. At the beginning of the program, I apologize for not being able to do so, simply because when we had proposed having the 3 candidates, there were only 3, but we subsequently learned that there were 7. And we have not been able to get a confirmation from the People's National Congress whether all 7 of those persons will be vying for the leadership. And added to that, the 3 persons whom we had identified to be on the program, 2 of them were unavailable to be on the program. So as a result of this, of us not having a confirmation as to what the numbers were, today we decided that we will cancel the program until another date when we have confirmed who and who will be vying, say, for the post of leadership. And then we will bring that to our people. I'm very sorry, I apologize to our viewers.
Your apology accepted.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Clayton, I think we need to reiterate that there are 7 persons who were nominated. 7 persons who were nominated.
Yes.
They have not yet gone through the process of determining how many of the 7 will actually run. Right? So we don't know as yet who are the real candidates who will be contesting. We know who will be nominated, 7 persons. And we can probably mention those 7, the names of those 7 persons. But we don't have, the PNC has not confirmed that of the 7 which have accepted nominations,
and will be
therefore
vying for
we are in no
position.
position as yet to really invite the true candidates. The 7 persons who are nominated would be Mr. Norton, Mr. Van West Charles, Mr. Harmon, Mr. Sharma, Ms. Lawrence,
Basil Williams.
Mr. Basil Williams, and
Carl Greenwich.
Mr. Carl Greenwich. Those are the 7 persons who were nominated. When
So-
we made the promise in the last occasion, there were 3 persons out there saying that they're running. And we sought to invite those 3 persons. 2 of them are unavailable. But we're in a different situation now because of the 7, we are not quite sure as yet how many are actually going to contest. And we only want to bring the actual contestants on a program like this.
Yeah, so you understand, I haven't ruled it out. I am still going to be looking at to see whether I can have them before the election on the 11th of December. I don't know if there are going to be any changes to that date, but for now we're working with the 11th of December. And as soon as we get that confirmation, I should be able to tell you, well, look, we're going to have them to talk about what their plans are. Our lines are still open. We have maybe 2 minutes or so before we close shop today. And Mr. Alexander has been very clear. I know there are issues that are out there. I know the people out there are very concerned in terms of, 1, the draconian measures, but the limited scope of the proposed amendments, and the unwillingness to have wider consultations to really address this matter, because there are views out there, say, from people who have an understanding and know-how as to what needs to be done to the electoral system, including addressing this question of the electoral list. I don't know if you wish to comment. We just have a minute or more to go.
The fact of the matter is that whilst they're saying they're involved in electoral reform, this is a very limited exercise that seeks to amend some elements of the Representation of the People's Act. It is not a holistic approach to electoral reform, and it is flying in the face of a commitment as far back as 2001 to continue a process that was commenced under constitutional reform. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that the way in which they're going about it does not provide for the real involvement of people, so that there are serious procedural issues that are here. And then the actual substantive things being suggested, again, are not addressing the wider issues of electoral reform. For example, the issues of constituencies, which is outstanding since 2001, the issue of the electoral roll, which has become a major issue during the 2020 elections. These matters are not being addressed, and the consultation does not provide the kind of interaction that will allow the people to go beyond commenting on what the drafters have so far come up with. And so the system is tremendously flawed. It is limited in the scope, and it's not really a true electoral reform process. It's an attempt to amend the RUPA to the benefit of those whose interest is reflected in the proposed amendments.
All right, thank you, Vincent. I want to say to our viewers, here again, we have been able to bring to you a program of interest, something that is will be affecting the lives of all Guyanese. And you need to perhaps get your act together, open your mouth, take action. This is a serious issue, and you need to make sure that your voice is heard in relation to these limited proposed amendments that have been put forward by the government. I want to thank you for being with me today. I want to thank you for allowing me in your space, at your homes, whether you're in the kitchen or in the living room. We'll be back with you again the fourth Sunday of the month of December, when we bring to you another program, State of the Nation. My name is Clayton Hines. Thank you.